last of the book. Professor Openshaw was a man of science. It was his pride to have given his whole life to studying psychic phenomenon. He always lost his temper if anybody said that he believed in ghosts, but he also lost his temper if anyone said that ghosts did not exist. "I am a man of science," he said one morning to Father Brown, who was a friend of his. They were standing on the steps outside the hotel, where both had been breakfasting that morning and sleeping the night before. The professor had come back rather late from one of his experiments. "I'm trying," he continued, "to explain psychic phenomenon scientifically. I've been working on this problem for a long time. I think a lot of psychic appearances can be explained scientifically, but cases of disappearance of people are much more difficult to explain. These people in the newspapers who vanish and are never found, if you knew the details as I do. Only this morning I have received an extraordinary letter from an old missionary, quite a respectable old boy. He's coming to see me at my office this morning. Perhaps you'd lunch with me or something, and I'd tell you the results." "Thanks, I shall," said Father Brown. They said goodbye to each other, and the professor walked around the corner to his small office, which he used for the publication of his scientific reports. He had only one clerk, a man named Berridge, who was at a desk in the outer office, working at some calculations for the professor's report. The professor paused to ask Mr. Pringle had called. The clerk answered mechanically in the negative, and went on mechanically adding up figures. The professor turned towards his study. "Oh, by the way, Berridge," he said without turning round, "if Mr. Pringle comes, send him straight to me. Go on with your work. I should like to have those notes for my report finished tonight, if possible. You may leave them on my desk tomorrow if I am late." And he went into his study, still thinking of the problem which the letter from Pringle had raised. He sat down in his large and comfortable chair, and read once more the short letter from Pringle. In this letter, Mr. Pringle asked permission to come and see the professor about some curious cases of disappearance of people. He knew that the professor was interested in psychic problems. The professor was surprised when he looked up and saw that the missionary was already in the room. "Your clerk told me I was to come straight in," said Mr. Pringle apologetically, but with a broad grin. The grin was almost lost in a thick, reddish-grey beard and whiskers that covered the missionary's face. He had a snub nose and frank, friendly eyes. Openshaw was a man of great detective ability. He could always tell at once if a man was honest or a humbug. He looked with great attention at his visitor, trying to see what sort of man Mr. Pringle was. He could not find anything suspicious about his appearance. In fact, he liked the friendly laughter in Mr. Pringle's eyes, laughter which is never found in the eyes of real humbugs. "You probably think," said Mr. Pringle, "I'm playing a joke on you, Professor. All the same, I must tell my story to somebody who knows, because it's true. And all joking apart, it's tragic as well as true. Well, to cut it short, I was a missionary in a small station in West Africa, in the thick of the forests. The only other white man there was the officer in command of the district, Captain Wales. He and I were very friendly soon. One day he came back to his tent in the forest after a short leave and said he wanted to tell me something. He was holding an old book in a leather binding, and he put it down on the table beside his revolver and an old Arab sword he had. He said this book had belonged to a man on the boat which he had just come off. That man had told him that nobody must open the book, or even look inside it. If anybody did, he would be carried off by the devil or disappear. Wales said to the man that this was all nonsense, of course, and they had a quarrel. The end of the story was very strange. Captain Wales said that the man did not look into the book, and then dropped it and walked to the side of the boat. "One moment," said the professor, who had made 1 or 2 notes. "Before you tell me anything else, did the man tell Wales where he had got the book, or who it belonged to?" "Yes," replied Pringle, now quite serious. "It seems he said he was bringing it back to Dr. Hankey, the Oriental traveller, now in England, to whom the book belonged, and who had warned the man about the book. The magic of the book was demonstrated when the man who had looked into it walked straight over the side of the ship and was never seen again." "Do you believe it yourself?" asked Openshaw after a pause. "Well, I do," replied Pringle. "I believe it for 2 reasons. First, that Wales was a very truthful man. He said that the man had walked straight over the side on a still and calm day, but there had been no splash. The professor looked at his notes for some seconds in silence, and then said, "And your other reason for believing it?" "My other reason," answered Mr. Pringle, "is what I saw myself." There was another silence until he continued again. "I told you that Captain Wales had put down the book on the table beside the sword. There was only one entrance to the tent, and it happened that I was standing in it, looking out into the forest with my back to my companion. He was standing by the table, grumbling that it was all nonsense, and that it was foolish in the 20th century to be frightened of opening a book, asking why the devil he couldn't open it himself. Then some instinct made me tell him that he had better not do that. The book had better be returned to Dr. Hankey. 'What harm could it do?' he asked restlessly. 'What harm did it do?' I answered him. 'What happened to your friend on the boat?' He did not answer. Indeed, I did not know what he could answer. 'If it comes to that,' I continued, 'what is your explanation of what really happened on the boat?' Still, he did not answer, and I looked round and saw that he wasn't there. The tent was empty. The book was lying on the table, open, but on its face, as if he had turned it downwards. But the sword was lying on the ground near the other side of the tent, and there was a great hole in the canvas of the tent, as if somebody had cut his way out with the sword. I have never seen or heard of Captain Wales from that day. I wrapped the book up in brown paper, taking good care not to look at it, and I brought it back to England, intending at first to return it to Dr. Hankey. Then I saw a report in your paper suggesting a hypothesis about such things, and I decided to stop on the way and put the matter before you." Professor Openshaw laid down his pen and looked attentively at the man on the other side of the table. He had met many different types of humbugs, and even some eccentric and extraordinary types of honest men. In the ordinary way, he would have begun with the healthy hypothesis that the story was a pack of lies. Yes, the best hypothesis would be to say that the story was a pack of lies. And yet, he could not make himself believe that the man was simply a liar. The man was not trying to look honest, as most humbugs do. It seemed that he was honest in spite of the queerness of the story. "Mr. Pringle," said the professor sharply, "where is the book now?" The grin reappeared on the bearded face, which had become quite serious during the recital of the story. "I left it outside," said Mr. Pringle. "I mean in the outer office. It was a risk, perhaps, but the less risk of the two." "What do you mean?" demanded the professor. "Why didn't you bring it straight in here?" "Because," answered the missionary, "I knew that as soon as you saw it, you would open it before you and heard the story. I thought it possible you might think twice about opening after you'd heard the story." Then, after a silence, he added, "There was nobody out there, only your clerk, and he looked a dull, honest man, busy with his calculations." "Oh, Berridge," laughed the professor, "your magic book is safe enough with him, I'm quite sure. He is just a calculating machine. Human beings like him, if you can call him a human being, would never think of opening other people's brown paper parcel. Let's go and get the book now. I'll tell you frankly that I'm not quite sure whether we ought to open it here, or now, or send it to Dr. Hankey." The two had passed together out of the professor's study into the outer office, and even as they did so, Mr. Pringle gave a cry and ran forward towards the clerk's desk, for the clerk's desk was there, but not the clerk. On the clerk's desk lay an old leather-bound book. It was lying closed, but as if it had just been opened. The clerk's desk stood against the wide window that looked out into the street, and the window was broken. The large hole in the glass looked as if a human body had just passed through it. There was no other trace of Mr. Berridge. The two men stood as still as statues, and then it was the professor who slowly came to life. He turned and held out his hand to the missionary. "Mr. Pringle," he said, "I beg your pardon. I beg your pardon only for thoughts that I have had. But nobody could call himself a scientific man and not face a fact like this. I suppose," said Mr. Pringle, "that we should ring up his house and find out if he has gone home." "I don't know if he's on the phone," answered Openshaw. "He lives somewhere up Hampstead way, I think. But I suppose somebody will ask him here, if his friends or family miss him." "Could we give a description of him if the police want it?" asked the other. "The police," said the professor. "A description? Well, he looked just like everybody else. He wore glasses, one of those clean-shaven fellows. But the police... Look here, what are we to do about this mad business?" "I know what I ought to do," said the missionary firmly. "I'm going to take this book to Dr. Hankey and ask him what the devil it's all about. He lives not very far from here, and I'll come straight back and tell you what he will say." "Oh, very well," said the professor at last, as he sat down. He was tired, and long after the quick footsteps of the missionary had died away down the street outside, the professor sat in the same position, staring at the wall and thinking hard. He was still in the same seat and almost in the same position when the same quick steps were heard in the street outside, and the missionary entered, this time with empty hands. "Dr. Hankey," said Mr. Pringle, "wants to keep the book for an hour and think over the matter. Then he asked us both to call on him, and he will give his decision. He very much desired, Professor, that you should accompany me on the second visit." Openshaw continued to stare in silence. Then he said suddenly, "Who the devil is Dr. Hankey?" "Do you mean, is he the devil?" asked Pringle, smiling. "I am sure some people have thought so. He is a scientific man like you. He has lived in India for a long time and studied magic there, so perhaps he is not so well known here. He's a thin, yellow-faced man with a lame leg, and he loses his temper very easily. Still, I don't know anything definitely wrong about him." Professor Openshaw rose heavily and went to the telephone. He rang up Father Brown and invited him to come to dinner instead of lunch. After that, he sat down again, lit a cigar, and concentrated his mind once more on the strange case. Father Brown waited in the vestibule of the restaurant to which he had been invited by the professor. He waited there for quite a long time. At last Openshaw and Pringle appeared, and it was clear that the professor was terribly excited by the strange things he had just seen and heard. They had found Dr. Hankey's house. They had found on the door a brass plate with the name J.D. Hankey, M.D. Only they did not find J.D. Hankey himself. What they did find was that terrible book lying on the table in the parlour, as if it had just been read. They also found a back door wide open and a few footmarks on the ground. It was a lame man that had run out of the house. It was clear from the footmarks themselves. There were only a few of them, and then nothing. There was nothing else to be learnt from Dr. J.D. Hankey, except that he had made his decision. He had read the book and received the punishment. Then the two came into the entrance under the palms. Pringle put the book down suddenly on a table, as if it burned his fingers. The priest glanced at it curiously. On the front page there was a couplet. "They that looked into this book, them the flying terror took." Under these lines were the translations of the couplet into Greek, Latin, and French. Openshaw called to the waiter, and he brought cocktails to them. "Will you dine with us, I hope?" said the professor to the missionary, but Mr. Pringle shook his head. "If you'll forgive me," he said, "I'm going to have to think over this whole business. Could I use your office for an hour or so?" "I suppose. I'm afraid it's locked," said Openshaw in some surprise. "You forget there's a hole in the window," said the missionary. He gave the very broadest of all his broad grins and vanished into the darkness outside. "A rather odd fellow," said the professor. When he turned to Father Brown, he was rather surprised to find him talking to the waiter who had brought the cocktails. The talk was about the waiter's baby, who had been ill and was out of danger now. "How did you come to know the man?" asked the professor. "Oh, I dine here every 2 or 3 months, and I've talked to him now and then," was the answer. The professor, who himself dined there about 5 times a week, had never even thought of talking to the waiter. At this moment, a telephone was heard ringing, and a few seconds later the professor was called to it. The voice on the telephone said it was Pringle. "Professor," said the voice, "I can't stand it any longer. I'm going to look into the book for myself. I'm speaking from your office, and the book is in front of me. If anything happens to me, this is to say goodbye. No, it's no use trying to stop me. You wouldn't be in time. I'm opening the book now. Openshaw thought he heard something like a crash. Then he shouted the name of Pringle again and again, but he heard no more. He hung up the receiver, went back, and quietly took his seat at the dinner table. Then, as calmly as he could, he told the priest every detail of this monstrous mystery. 5 men have disappeared in this impossible way, he said. Every case is extraordinary, but the most extraordinary is the case of my clerk, Berridge. It's just because he was one of the quietest creatures that his case is the queerest one. Yes, replied Father Brown, it was a queer thing for Berridge to do. He was always so careful to keep all the office business separate from any fun of his own. Why, I'm sure nobody knew he was quite a humorist at home, and... Berridge, cried the professor. What on earth are you talking about? Did you know him? Oh, no, said Father Brown carelessly. Only, as I know the waiter, I've often had to wait in your office, and of course I talked to him. He was rather a character, and even eccentric, I should say. I'm not sure what you're talking about, said Openshaw. But even if my clerk was eccentric, and I've never known a man who would be less eccentric than Berridge, It doesn't explain what happened to him, and it certainly can't explain the other cases of disappearance." "What other cases?" asked the priest. The professor stared at him and spoke slowly and loudly as if to a child. "My dear Father Brown, 5 men have disappeared. My dear Professor Openshaw, no men have disappeared." Father Brown stared back at the professor and spoke as slowly and as loudly. "I say that no men have disappeared," he repeated. After a moment's silence, he added, "I suppose the hardest thing is to prove that 0 plus 0 plus 0 equals 0. Men believe the oddest things sometimes, but in your case there is a very weak point." "What do you mean?" "You saw nobody vanish. You did not see the man vanish from the boat. You did not see the man vanish from the tent. You have simply taken the word of Mr. Pringle, and I'm sure you would never have taken his word if your clerk had not disappeared." "That may be true," said the professor slowly. "You say I saw nothing myself, but I did. I saw my own clerk disappear. Berridge did disappear." "Berridge did not disappear," said Father Brown. "On the contrary." "What the devil do you mean by 'on the contrary'?" "I mean," said Father Brown, "that he never disappeared. He appeared." Openshaw stared across at his friend, but the priest went on. "He appeared in your study, disguised in a thick red beard, and introduced himself as Missionary Pringle. And you had never noticed your own clerk enough to recognize him when he was in so rough and ready a disguise." "But listen," began the professor. "Could you describe him to the police?" asked Father Brown. "Not you. You knew perhaps that he was clean-shaven and wore glasses. Taking off those glasses was a better disguise than putting on anything else. You had never seen his eyes, his laughing eyes. He had put his absurd book on the table in your office. Then he calmly broke the window, put on the beard, and walked into your study, knowing very well that you had never looked at him in your life." "But why should he have played such a mad trick on me?" demanded Openshaw. "Why? Because you had never looked at him in your life," said Father Brown. "You called him the calculating machine, because that was all you ever used him for. You never found out that he was a character, that he had his own views on you and your theories. You thought you could see through anybody. Can't you see his mad desire to prove that you could not see through your own clerk? Don't you know the story of the woman who bought 2 most useless things, an old doctor's brass plate and a wooden leg? With those 2 things your clerk created the character of Dr. Hankey. He did it as easily as he created the character of Captain Wales. He placed the brass plate with the name of Dr. Hankey on the door of his own house." "Do you mean that the place we visited at Hampstead Road was Berridge's own house?" asked Openshaw. "Did you know his house, or even his address?" said the priest. "Look here, I think highly of you and your work. You have seen through a lot of liars. But don't only look at liars. Sometimes do look at honest men, like the waiter." "Where is Berridge now?" asked the professor after a long silence. "I haven't the least doubt," said Father Brown, "that he is back in your office. In fact, he came back into your office at the exact moment when Mr. Pringle read the awful book and disappeared." There was another long silence, and then Professor Openshaw laughed. He laughed with the laugh of a great man who is great enough to look small. Then he said, "I suppose I do deserve it, for not noticing the nearest helpers I have. But don't you think that all these incidents coming one after the other could frighten anybody? Did you never feel, just for a moment only, that you were frightened of that awful book?" "Oh, that," said Father Brown. "I opened the book as soon as I saw it lying there. It's all blank pages."